Ladies and gentlemen, as we gather today, let me speak directly to your spirit about a profound truth. God has a way of using what was meant to harm you to elevate you. In life, we often face opposition, resistance, and sometimes outright hostility from others. These moments can leave us questioning, why am I facing so much opposition if I am doing what's right? But I want to shift your perspective. Opposition is not always a sign of failure or misdirection. Often, it is confirmation that you are on the path God has ordained for you. Your enemies are not always there by accident. God, in His infinite wisdom, allows them to appear not to destroy you, but to refine you, to position you, and to prepare you for the blessing that lies ahead. When you see resistance, it doesn't mean that God has forgotten you. On the contrary, it means He is orchestrating something greater. Let's think about this. If God wanted to, He could remove all your enemies with one word. But He doesn't. Why? Because their presence has a purpose. Your enemies are part of the process that leads to your elevation. When we look at the life of Joseph, we see a man who faced betrayal, false accusations, and years of hardship. His own brothers, his flesh and blood, became his enemies. They sold him into slavery, thinking they had rid themselves of him forever. But what they didn't realize was that their actions were positioning Joseph for the very thing they feared, his elevation. Had it not been for the betrayal, Joseph would have never made it to Egypt. Without Egypt, there would have been no Pharaoh's palace. Without Pharaoh's palace, there would have been no fulfillment of God's promise. Joseph's enemies were not the end of his story, they were the beginning of his divine purpose. And this principle is not limited to Joseph. It is a pattern we see throughout Scripture. David, before he became king, faced Goliath, a giant who mocked not only him but the God of Israel. That opposition was not an obstacle, it was an opportunity. The presence of Goliath didn't stop David, it propelled him into the spotlight, marking the beginning of his journey to the throne. God uses the very things designed to intimidate you to usher you into your destiny. Psalm 23:5 reminds us of a beautiful promise. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now, let's pause and think about this imagery. A table is not prepared in haste or chaos. It is carefully arranged, thoughtfully designed, and filled with provision. God doesn't just bless you privately. He prepares a public demonstration of His favor, and He does it deliberately in the presence of those who doubted you, those who underestimated you, and those who sought to hinder you. Why does God do this? Because the blessing is not just for your benefit, it is also for His glory. When God blesses you in front of your enemies, it is His way of declaring, "This is my child, and no one can stop what I have planned." But here's the challenge. How will you respond in the presence of your enemies? Will you allow bitterness, anger, or fear to consume you? Or will you trust God enough to stay focused on the table He is preparing? Remember, your character in the face of opposition is a critical part of your journey. It's easy to lose sight of the blessing when you're surrounded by negativity, but God calls us to rise above. He calls us to walk in love, humility, and faith, even when others try to pull us down. The story of Daniel in the lion's den is another powerful reminder of this truth. Daniel's enemies conspired against him, plotting his downfall. But Daniel didn't respond with fear or retaliation. He continued to pray and trust God, knowing that the God who had brought him this far was not about to abandon him. And what happened? The very trap his enemies set for him became their downfall. God didn't just save Daniel, He elevated him, and his enemies became witnesses to God's power. This brings us to another vital truth. When God decides to bless you, no one can stop Him. It doesn't matter what they say, what they do, or how they conspire. The blessing of the Lord is unstoppable. Isaiah 54:17 declares, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." Notice, it doesn't say the weapons won't form. It says they won't prosper. Your enemies may plot, but their plans will fail because they cannot override the plans of God. And here's something to remember. The battlefield of your life is not just a place of struggle, it is a platform for God's greatness to be revealed. What your enemies meant for harm, God will use for good. The very things they thought would destroy you will become the foundation of your testimony. Joseph said it best when he told his brothers in Genesis 50:20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Every trial, every attack, and every moment of opposition is part of a larger narrative that God is writing. And in this narrative, the victory is already assured. Your enemies may surround you, but they cannot defeat you. They may try to silence you, but they cannot mute the voice of God speaking over your life. They may try to block your progress, but they cannot stop the hand of God from lifting you higher. So the next time you face opposition, don't despair. Don't let fear or frustration take root. Instead, stand firm and remember that God is in control. He is preparing something extraordinary for you, and when the blessing comes, it will be so undeniable, so overwhelming, that even your enemies will have to acknowledge it. God's purpose for your life will prevail, and His glory will be revealed through you. Psalm 23:5 paints one of the most powerful and vivid images of God's favor at work. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. This verse reveals an important truth about how God works in our lives. It shows us that His blessings are not just for our private enjoyment, they are also a public demonstration of His power, His faithfulness, and His glory. When God prepares a table, He does so with intention. A prepared table represents provision, abundance, and peace. But what makes this imagery so profound is the location of the table right in the presence of your enemies. God doesn't wait until your enemies have been defeated or removed. He doesn't wait for the circumstances to be perfect. Instead, He sets the table in their sight, ensuring that they witness what He is doing in your life. This is not an act of arrogance, but an act of divine purpose. God showcases His blessings in the presence of your enemies to make a statement that His favor cannot be blocked, hindered, or hidden. This is a concept that can be both comforting and challenging. Many of us would prefer that God remove our enemies altogether. It's natural to want the obstacles gone, the naysayers silenced, and the opposition eradicated. But God's strategy is different. Instead of removing the enemies, He blesses us while they watch. Why? Because the presence of the enemy serves a purpose. It amplifies the testimony of God's power. It ensures that His glory is undeniable and His hand in your life is unquestionable. Consider the story of the Israelites as they left Egypt. God didn't simply free them from Pharaoh's oppression and let them leave unnoticed. Instead, He orchestrated their departure in such a way that even Pharaoh and his army witnessed His might. When the Red Sea parted, it wasn't just a miracle for the Israelites, it was a display of God's power for their enemies to see. And when the waters closed, the same God who delivered His people proved that no enemy could stand against Him. The table was prepared in the presence of Pharaoh, and it left no room for doubt about who was in control. Now let's think about what this means for us today. When God prepares a table in the presence of your enemies, it is not just about giving you blessings, it's about giving you peace. Imagine sitting at a table, enjoying a feast while your enemies surround you. This scene speaks volumes about the kind of peace God offers. It is not a peace that depends on the absence of conflict. It is a peace that surpasses understanding, a peace that allows you to rest even when you are surrounded by challenges. And what a table it is! God doesn't prepare an ordinary table. It is a table of abundance overflowing with His goodness. It is a table of restoration where the years of loss are replaced with blessings. It is a table of healing where wounds inflicted by others are healed by His love. It is a table of favor where doors that were once closed are opened wide. And all of this happens not in secret but in full view of those who doubted you, opposed you, and even tried to harm you. This divine preparation is not meant to fuel pride or a desire for revenge. It is not about gloating over your enemies. Instead, it is about pointing back to God, who is the source of every blessing. When others see what God is doing in your life, it becomes a testimony that draws attention to His power and faithfulness. It is an opportunity for His glory to be revealed, not just to you, but to everyone around you, even your enemies. The story of Esther gives us another vivid example of this truth. Haman, the enemy of the Jews, plotted to destroy them and sought to humiliate Mordecai, a faithful servant of God. But God had other plans. Not only was Haman's plot exposed, but the very gallows he built for Mordecai became the instrument of his own downfall. Meanwhile, Mordecai was elevated to a position of honor, and the people of Israel were saved. God prepared a table for his people in the presence of their enemies, and his glory was unmistakable. What does this mean for you? It means that no matter who or what stands against you, God's blessings cannot be stopped. It means that even when you are surrounded by those who wish to see you fail, God is preparing something extraordinary for you. The presence of your enemies does not hinder his work, it highlights it. When God sets the table, it is not contingent on their approval. They can watch, but they cannot interfere. They can doubt, but they cannot deny the evidence of his favor. So the next time you feel surrounded by opposition, remember this: God is preparing a table for you. Don't focus on the enemies, focus on the feast. Don't be distracted by their words or actions, be assured by God's promises. The table is already being set, and when the time comes, you will sit down and enjoy the blessings he has prepared. And as you do, your enemies will witness not your strength, but his. Your character is one of the most vital elements of your journey, especially when you are facing opposition. The truth is, the blessing God has for you is not just about the destination, it's also about the person you become along the way. Your enemies may plot against you, but their actions are not what determines the outcome. Your response does. It is not the size of the opposition, but the posture of your heart that determines whether you are ready to receive what God has prepared for you. Adversity is a test, and like every test, it reveals what is inside you. It is easy to talk about faith when everything is going well. It is easy to sing praises when you are surrounded by friends and supporters. But the real measure of your character is how you respond when you are attacked, criticized, or treated unfairly. Will you allow bitterness to take root? Will you react with anger and retaliation? Or will you stay faithful, focused, and aligned with God's will? Jesus is our perfect example of maintaining character in the face of adversity. During his ministry, he was misunderstood, falsely accused, and ultimately crucified by those who hated him. Yet he never wavered in his purpose. Even as he hung on the cross, he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. This is the kind of character God calls us to have: a heart that remains steadfast and a spirit that refuses to be consumed by the actions of others. The way you respond to your enemies has a direct impact on your ability to walk into the blessing God has for you. Why? Because God is not just interested in blessing you, he is interested in refining you. He wants you to have the integrity, humility, and wisdom to handle the blessing when it comes. If you allow your enemies to provoke you into bitterness or vengeance, you risk forfeiting the very thing God is trying to prepare you for. Take David, for example. Before he became king, he was relentlessly pursued by King Saul, who sought to kill him out of jealousy. David had multiple opportunities to retaliate and take Saul's life, but he chose not to. Instead, he said, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed one," Samuel 24:6. David understood that his destiny was in God's hands, not Saul's, and he refused to compromise his character even under immense pressure. This decision not only preserved his integrity, but also positioned him for the throne. Your response in moments of adversity is a reflection of your trust in God. Do you believe that he will fight your battles, or do you feel the need to take matters into your own hands? It can be tempting to lash out, defend yourself, or seek revenge when you are wronged. But Scripture reminds us in Romans 12:19, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." Trusting God means letting go of the need to control the situation and allowing him to handle it in his time and his way. Adversity also has a way of revealing what truly matters to us. Are we more concerned with vindicating ourselves in front of our enemies, or are we focused on honoring God? If your priority is to glorify God, then your response will reflect that. You will choose patience over anger, humility over pride, and love over hate. These choices may not be easy, but they are necessary for the blessing to manifest in your life. Remember, your enemies are watching you, but so is God. He sees not only what they are doing, but also how you are responding. Your faithfulness in the face of adversity is what qualifies you for the next level. It is not about proving your worth to others, it is about proving your readiness to God. When you handle opposition with grace and integrity, you demonstrate that you are prepared to steward the blessing He has for you. Joseph is another powerful example of character in adversity. Betrayed by his brothers, falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and forgotten in prison, Joseph had every reason to become bitter. Yet, he remained faithful to God. He did not allow his circumstances or the actions of others to dictate his character. When the time came for his elevation, Joseph was ready not just because of his gifts or talents, but because of the strength of his character. He was able to look his brothers in the eye and say, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50:20. That is the power of a heart that stays aligned with God, even in adversity. So, as you face challenges, ask yourself, how am I responding? Am I allowing the actions of others to dictate my behavior, or am I staying rooted in God's truth? Am I reacting out of emotion, or am I responding with wisdom and faith? These moments of reflection are crucial because they shape your readiness for the blessing that lies ahead. God's blessings are not contingent on the actions of your enemies, they are contingent on your faithfulness to Him. Stay focused on what He has called you to do. Do not be distracted by the noise around you. Let your response be a testimony of His grace at work in your life. When you maintain your character in the face of adversity, you position yourself for the extraordinary blessings God has already prepared for you. God's blessing is unstoppable. It is a truth that should resonate deeply in your heart and fuel your faith every day. No enemy, no opposition, no obstacle, and no weapon formed against you can cancel what God has ordained for your life. The plans of men may falter, the strategies of your enemies may crumble, and the schemes of the adversary may come to nothing, but the purposes of God will stand firm forever. When God speaks a word over your life, it is final. His word does not return to Him void, but accomplishes what He has sent it out to do. Isaiah 14:27 declares, "For the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart Him? His hand is stretched out, and who can turn it back?" This is the confidence we have in the sovereignty of God. What He has ordained cannot be undone, no matter how fierce the opposition. Consider the story of the Israelites as they stood on the edge of the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in behind them. From a human perspective, it looked like their journey was over. Their enemies were stronger, their resources were limited, and their path was blocked. But what Pharaoh didn't know was that God had already declared freedom for His people, and no amount of military power could override that decree. With one command, God parted the waters, creating a way where there was no way. The very sea that seemed like an obstacle became the pathway to their deliverance. God's blessing was unstoppable, and His people walked into their destiny on dry ground. The unstoppable nature of God's blessing is not just about the big, miraculous moments, it is also about His faithfulness in the small, everyday battles. Sometimes the enemy doesn't come with chariots and armies, but with subtle doubts, discouragement, and distractions. He whispers lies that make you question whether God's promise will ever come to pass. But even in those moments, you must remind yourself of this truth: the blessing is not dependent on your circumstances, it is anchored in God's unchanging character. If He said it, He will do it. If He promised it, He will fulfill it. The enemy's greatest weapon against you is deception. He wants you to believe that your current situation defines your future. He wants you to think that the opposition you face is stronger than the God you serve. But the Bible reminds us in Isaiah 54:17, No weapon formed against you shall prosper. Notice, it doesn't say the weapon won't form, it says it won't succeed. The attacks may come, but they cannot derail God's plan. The opposition may rise, but it cannot overthrow his authority. The delay may frustrate you, but it cannot cancel his promise. The blessing is unstoppable. Look at the life of Job. Here was a man who lost everything: his wealth, his family, his health. The enemy threw everything he could at Job, trying to break him, to make him curse God, to make him give up. But Job's story didn't end in defeat. Despite the overwhelming trials, Job remained faithful and God restored him. Not only did Job receive back what he had lost, but God doubled it. The enemy's attacks couldn't stop God's blessing, because Job's life was anchored in the promises of a sovereign God. This truth applies to you as well. The challenges you face, the people who rise against you, the circumstances that seem insurmountable, none of these have the power to cancel what God has declared over your life. His hand is upon you and his plans for you are good. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Even when it feels like everything is working against you, trust that God is working behind the scenes. Sometimes the blessing doesn't come in the way you expect or at the time you anticipate, but that doesn't mean it's not coming. God's timing is perfect and his methods are beyond our understanding. What looks like a setback is often a setup for something greater. What seems like a delay is often God's way of preparing you for the magnitude of the blessing he has in store. The unstoppable nature of God's blessing is also a reminder that you don't have to fight every battle in your own strength. In 2 Chronicles 20:15, God told King Jehoshaphat, "Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army. For the battle is not yours, but God's." The blessing doesn't depend on your ability to outmaneuver your enemies. It depends on God's ability to fulfill his word. Your job is to remain faithful, obedient, and trusting. His job is to ensure that his purpose is accomplished. And here is another important truth: the blessing is not just about you. When God blesses you, it is often so that others can see his goodness and be drawn to him. Your testimony becomes a declaration of his power and faithfulness. When the world sees that no opposition could stop what God was doing in your life, it points them to the one who is greater than any obstacle. The blessing becomes a tool for his glory. So, as you walk through life, hold on to this assurance: no matter what comes against you, God's blessing cannot be stopped. The enemies may form their plans, but they cannot prevail. The challenges may be great, but they cannot outmatch the power of your God. Stand firm in this truth and keep moving forward. The God who began a good work in you will carry it to completion. His blessing is unstoppable. One of the most profound aspects of God's blessing is its ability to transform what looks like a battlefield into a platform. What the enemy meant for harm, God uses for good. What was designed to break you becomes the very thing that elevates you. This is the redemptive power of God. He takes the attacks, the struggles, and the challenges and turns them into opportunities for his greatness to shine through your life. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph declares a powerful truth to his brothers: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done." The saving of many lives, Joseph's life, is a testimony of how God can turn a battlefield into a platform. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned, Joseph's journey seemed riddled with defeat. Yet every step of the way, God was positioning him for a greater purpose. What appeared to be a series of setbacks were actually setups for his elevation. When Joseph was finally placed in a position of power in Egypt, the same brothers who had wronged him came to him for help. And he was able to save not only his family, but an entire nation. This pattern is consistent throughout Scripture. Time and time again, we see God using what was meant for destruction as a platform for his glory. Look at David. When he faced Goliath, it wasn't just a fight, it was a defining moment. Goliath was an enemy meant to intimidate and destroy, but that battlefield became the platform that launched David into his destiny as a leader and king. David's victory wasn't just about defeating the giant, it was about demonstrating the power of God working through someone who trusted him completely. The battlefield is the last place anyone would expect to find blessing. But that's exactly where God works. He takes the spaces in your life that feel like war zones, your struggles, your pain, your opposition, and turns them into stages where His power and purpose are revealed. When you face battles, you must remember that they are not the end of your story. Instead, they are the means by which God will elevate you and display His glory. Think about Daniel in the lion's den. To the natural eye, that den was a place of certain death. It was a punishment meant to silence and destroy him. But in God's hands, it became a platform for His power. When Daniel emerged unharmed, the same king who had condemned him issued a decree honoring the God of Daniel. The very place meant to be his downfall became the stage for God's greatness to shine. Your life is no different. The challenges you face, the people who oppose you, and the circumstances that seem insurmountable, none of these are wasted. God has a way of taking the very things the enemy uses against you and turning them into opportunities for His purpose to unfold. The platform isn't just about your success, it's about His glory. When others see how God has brought you through, how He has elevated you despite the odds, they are drawn to Him. Your life becomes a living testimony of His faithfulness. In moments of struggle, it's easy to focus on the battle itself, on the pain, the difficulty, and the uncertainty. But when you shift your perspective to see the potential for God to use that situation as a platform, everything changes. You begin to understand that the battle isn't just about opposition, it's about transformation. God is not just trying to deliver you from something, He's preparing to elevate you into something greater. Even Jesus' greatest battlefield, Calvary, became the ultimate platform. The cross was meant to be a symbol of shame and defeat, a weapon used to silence and kill. Yet, through the resurrection, it became the stage for God's ultimate victory over sin and death. What the enemy meant to destroy became the cornerstone of salvation for all humanity. This truth is a reminder that no matter how dark the battlefield may seem, it holds the potential to be the very place where God's light shines the brightest. The key is in how you respond. Will you trust Him in the midst of the battle? Will you allow Him to use your struggles to refine you and position you for something greater? Or will you let the enemy's attacks distract you from the bigger picture? When you align yourself with God's purpose, every battle becomes a stepping stone. The hardships you endure prepare you for the platform He is building for you. They teach you resilience, faith, and dependence on Him. And when the blessing comes, it will be evident to everyone watching that it wasn't your strength or strategy that brought you through, it was God's hand upon your life. So when you find yourself in the middle of a battlefield, remember that God is already working to turn it into a platform. The opposition you face is not a sign of defeat, but an opportunity for His power to be revealed. The enemy's plan to harm you will only serve to advance God's purpose in your life. Trust Him, stand firm, and watch as He transforms your battles into blessings and your struggles into stages for His glory. Your victory is never just about you, it is about making God's power and grace undeniable. Even to those who oppose you, God's favor on your life is not hidden, it is a public declaration of His sovereignty, a testimony that even your adversaries cannot ignore. When God grants you victory, it is not only a blessing for you, but also a revelation for others, turning your enemies into witnesses of His power and glory. The story of Pharaoh and the Israelites is a profound example of this truth. When God sent Moses to deliver His people, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he refused to let them go. But each act of defiance only provided a greater stage for God to demonstrate His power. The 10 plagues were not random acts of judgment, they were calculated displays of His authority over every false god Pharaoh trusted. When the Red Sea parted, it wasn't just a miraculous escape for the Israelites, it was a spectacle that left no doubt about who the true God was. Pharaoh and his army witnessed the greatness of God, even in their defeat. This principle is woven throughout Scripture. God often uses His favor on His people as a testimony to the watching world. In Psalm 23:5, David declares, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." This imagery is not just about personal blessing, it is about a public display of God's goodness. When God blesses you, He ensures that even those who doubted you, opposed you, or tried to harm you will see His hand on your life. Consider the life of Nehemiah. When he set out to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, he faced relentless opposition from Sanballat, Tobiah, and others who mocked and ridiculed his efforts. They tried to discourage him, spread false reports, and even threatened his life. But Nehemiah remained steadfast, trusting in God's purpose. When the wall was completed in just 52 days, even his enemies had to admit that the work had been accomplished with the help of God. What began as opposition ended as a testimony. Nehemiah's victory was undeniable evidence of God's favor and faithfulness. The same applies to your life. When God brings you through trials, defeats the obstacles in your path, and elevates you to new heights, it is not only for your benefit but also to demonstrate His power to everyone watching. Your adversaries may not understand it, they may resist it, but they cannot deny it. God's hand on your life will speak louder than any opposition. This is why it is so important to remain faithful during times of adversity. Your response to trials is part of your testimony. When you trust God in the face of opposition, when you continue to walk in obedience despite challenges, you position yourself for a victory that will make His glory evident. Your perseverance becomes a witness to His sustaining grace, and your triumph becomes a declaration of His greatness. Jesus' life and ministry perfectly embody this principle. Throughout His earthly journey, He faced constant opposition from religious leaders who sought to discredit Him. They plotted against Him, questioned His authority, and ultimately orchestrated His crucifixion. But what they intended as a final defeat became the ultimate victory. The resurrection was not only a triumph over death, it was a testimony to everyone, including His enemies, that He was indeed the Son of God. Even the Roman centurion at the cross declared, "Surely this man was the Son of God," Mark 15:39. His victory turned doubters into witnesses of God's power. This truth gives you confidence as you navigate your own challenges. The opposition you face is not the end of your story, it is a setup for God to display His greatness. The harder the enemy works against you, the greater the testimony of God's favor when you emerge victorious. Your life becomes a living declaration of His faithfulness, and even those who stood against you will have no choice but to recognize His hand on you. Joseph's story is another powerful reminder. When his brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery, they thought they were ending his dreams. But God's plan was unstoppable. Every step of Joseph's journey, from the pit to Potiphar's house, from prison to the palace, was a testimony of God's sovereignty. When Joseph rose to power and saved his family during the famine, his brothers were forced to confront the reality of God's favor on his life. What they intended for harm, God used for good, turning their betrayal into a platform for His glory. Your victory is not just a personal accomplishment, it is a message. It declares that God is faithful to His promises, that He is greater than any opposition, and that His purpose cannot be thwarted. It silences the voices of doubt and magnifies His name. Even those who once sought to undermine you will have to acknowledge that your success is not by your strength but by His Spirit. So as you walk through challenges, hold on to this truth: your victory is their witness. Keep your heart aligned with God. Trust Him through every trial, and watch as He turns your opposition into an opportunity for His glory to be revealed. When the breakthrough comes, and it will, your life will stand as a testimony that the God you serve is mighty, faithful, and unstoppable. As we draw to a close, let me remind you of this unshakable truth: the God who created you, called you, and anointed you has already ordained your victory. He is not intimidated by your enemies, and neither should you be. The opposition you face is not a sign of defeat. It is the backdrop for God's power to be revealed. Every challenge, every setback, every weapon formed against you will only serve to magnify the greatness of the one who fights for you. God has a way of taking what was meant to harm you and turning it into the very stage where His glory shines brightest. Your enemies may surround you, but they will not prevail. Your adversaries may plot, but their plans will fail. What they cannot stop is the favor of God on your life. He will prepare a table for you in their presence, transforming every battlefield into a platform, every trial into a triumph, and every struggle into a story of His faithfulness. So stay steadfast. Guard your heart. Keep your character intact, for the blessing is not just about where you're going, it's about who you are becoming. Trust that the God who began a good work in you will complete it. Let His promises anchor you, His power sustain you, and His purpose guide you. When the victory comes, and it will know this, it won't just be your triumph. It will be a testimony. It will declare to your enemies, your friends, and even to those who doubted you that the hand of God is upon your life. And when they witness what He has done, they won't just see you, they will see Him. You are not defeated. You are not forgotten. You are chosen, called, and destined. Walk boldly, for the Lord is with you, and the blessing He has ordained for your life is unstoppable. Go forward in faith, and let the world see the power of a God who blesses His people in the presence of their enemies.